If somebody will just let me know that you can see that and what that looks like, that would be great.
We can see it.
Okay. I lose my chat. So Jamie, if there's anything in the chat, just let me know what that is and we will go from there.
Okay.
So as we get started today, self-care for educators, I really would like for everybody to be open-minded. So why do we think it's so important that we're open-minded as we talk about self-care? Drop in the chat. Why is it important to be open-minded? Notice the quote. It is impossible to learn what you think you already know. So why is it important to be open-minded? So you can learn, so you can grow, absolutely. So for the next 60 minutes, it's about 55 minutes now, I guess, but for the next 60 minutes, I want you to be thinking about the two phrases, mindful or mindful. So look at this image and think about what the difference is. And then I want you to think about where you are today. Are you the picture or the thought bubble on the left where your mind is full of things, full of clutter? You may feel like you're juggling a lot of things. Or are you the mindful on the right, the thought bubble on the right, where your mind is clear and you are thinking about focusing on new learning, where you're thinking about focusing on yourself? Sometimes it's really hard to be the one on the right, and we know that. A lot of us go throughout the day, go throughout our weeks, in classrooms and schools with the thought bubble on the left. So I'm going to give you just a second to look at those two and think about that. Anybody feel like the lady in the picture? Do you feel like you're juggling 100 things every second of every day? Absolutely. So we may learn or experience something new or different today. Please be mindful and respectful to others if they share some of their self-care routines or ideas that may differ from your own. And what do we mean when we say be present and we're using BEE? What do we mean when we say that? Limit distractions in order to focus, be in the moment. So when we're present, we're in the moment and we're focused on what we're doing, how we're feeling, what we're thinking, and what we're saying. For some of us, we're not in the moment very often. So as we get started today, we're going to start with, this is called a guided focus or guided visual imagery. So I want you to take a couple deep breaths in through your nose, out through your nose. Take a couple slow breaths. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing so, or if you're in a space where you can. If not, I completely understand. And just listen for the next few minutes. Close your eyes and bring yourself to a calm, quiet place in your mind. Stay here and relax for just a few moments. Breathe deep. Get comfortable. Notice how it feels to tune into your body. Listen as the air moves in and out. It's a quiet and beautiful sound. Now imagine transporting yourself to a warm, sunny beach. You can choose your favorite beach or somewhere you've never been. Just imagine what it might be like. Picture yourself there now. At the edge of the ocean, you can feel the lapping of the warm waves against your feet. Let your toes sink deeply into the wet sand. The sunshine brightly and gently warms your face. It's as if the sun is reaching down, warm and kind. As you slowly walk along, you feel the rhythm of the calm waves flowing over the sand. You look out across the horizon and all you see is deep blue water and bright blue sky. The ocean is so very big. Notice how your breathing becomes calm and even, inhaling and exhaling slowly and calmly. Paying attention now, You slow down your breathing even further. You allow your muscles to relax. You feel the muscles in your shoulders relax, in your back relax, in your face relax, as you feel the warmth of the sun melting you into complete relaxation. As you begin to relax, you can feel the release of tension or frustration, releasing any worry or doubt you may have. The waves of the ocean pull them back into the sea. The ocean reminds us of its abundance. There's always plenty to go around. Think about all the fish, all the plants that live in the ocean, how many teeny tiny grains of sand there are under your feet. Your body feels relaxed and your mind is relaxed too. You are able to empty your mind of worries, of thoughts, anything that has been bothering you today. Just enjoy the moment you have now. The tranquility you feel can be yours at any time. You can imagine yourself standing at this ocean of possibility whenever you need to remember how big, abundant, and giving the world is. Imagine the beautiful golden, warm sun each day hitting every cell and muscle in your body, making you feel so wonderful and so alive. I'm sure you can feel the peace that surrounds you, letting you know that everything will be all right. Now take in a nice deep breath again. Inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. And bring your attention back to where you are in the present. When you're ready, open your eyes, stretch a bit, and keep that peaceful feeling with you as we move forward. So I want to take just a second and let you refocus and come back to where we are. I want you really quickly just to drop something in the chat if you feel any differently now than you did when you got on at 4 o'clock today. If you do feel different, how? Do your shoulders feel different? Does your focus feel different? Anything that feels different, just go ahead and drop that in the chat. Now, what we just did was called visual imagery. It can also be called a guided meditation. How many of you have ever done that with kids in your classroom? A couple. Sometimes it's really hard to do something such as guided visualization or the guided meditation if we ourselves are not comfortable with it. So one of the things that I want you to think about as we go throughout today is this is self-care for educators. So it's obviously for each of you, but I also want you to think about how these practices could apply to your classrooms. How could these practices help you as you work with students on a daily basis? So as you can see on the next slide, it says, what does self-care mean to you? Self-care is going to mean something a little bit different to every single one of us. When we hear the term self-care or we think about it, we're going to think about different things. We're going to think about different people, and we're going to think about different practices. And that's fine. So when we in education oftentimes think about a strategy or a skill, we think about what the research tells us the best way to teach kids to do something is. So I think for some of us in education, it's really hard to think about self-care strategies for ourselves that they can look different. So what I like to do and what Jamie likes to do can be two very different things, and that is perfectly fine as long as it gets us to the same place, which is being the best us we can be. So I want you to think about that and remember that as we go throughout today. So as we talk about self-care, what is it? The definition is any intentional action taken to increase a person's physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. So one of the things that I think self-care sometimes gets a negative or bad rap with some of the pieces with teachers in school, but I think that it's really important we think about self-care as intentional, number one. But number two, it's more than just for our mental health or emotional well-being. It's also for our physical health. So when we think about well-being, we're going to think about all of those different domains. We're going to think about physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health as we go throughout today. Notice it also says attention to and regulation of our overall mental and physical health. So it's under the individual's control, it's deliberate, and it's self-initiated. So when we think about physical health, if I decide myself to go for a walk, then that's self-initiated. But if I'm in a PE class in high school and my teacher is making me run, that is not self-initiated. That is something else. So I want you to be thinking about that self-initiated, and it's deliberate and intentional. Notice the graphic at the bottom. It does include the 7 pillars of self-care. There will not be a quiz at the end of today, but in case anyone is interested, those are the 7 pillars of self-care. So notice their knowledge and health literacy, mental well-being, physical activity, healthy eating, risk avoidance, good hygiene, and then rational use of products and services. So those are our 7 pillars. We have all seen the picture or heard the phrase, you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So the holidays are approaching. We have our Starbucks coffee cups on the ledge there. Why is it so important that we focus on self-care for each and every one of us? I want you to look at those coffee cups. Why do you think it's so important? Notice the thought bubble says, how much does each cup have in it? Who can answer that question? How much does each cup have in it? Okay, so several of you have said we have no way of knowing how much is in each cup, and you're exactly right. So I want you to think about how that applies to us. How does that apply to us as adults or teachers? And it really can apply even to our students. But from the outside looking in, we can't tell how much each person's cup has in it. We can't tell if it's half empty, if it's half full, if it's completely empty, or if it's totally full. So when we think about things like compassion and kindness, that's one of the reasons that number one, we want to take care of ourselves. And number two, that we should always be practicing those things with others. We can't tell. Sometimes things look really great from the outside. I'm looking at those cups, and each and every one of them I can imagine has a different kind of coffee in it or a different tea in it, and they're probably all delicious. But if every one of those cups is empty, then it doesn't really matter which one I choose. So I want you to think about that and think about how much is in your cup. Others can't always tell, and you can't tell what's in others' cups. The only thing we can control is our own cup, so to speak. So when we think about that common phrase, you can't pour from an empty cup, I want you to always be thinking about how much is in my cup. Am I completely empty and I'm still trying to pour out of it? So that's something to think about as we talk about some of the practices today. So what are some of the barriers of self-care? Anybody feel any of these barriers on a daily basis? We have lesson planning and paying bills and juggling all the different pieces, dealing with students' behaviors and mental health in the classroom, maybe our own personal kids. One of the biggest distractors or barriers is our cell phone or our watch that we keep on us. We are constantly inundated with technology and information and news. Notice down at the bottom, it says more than 44% of teachers, and this was a recent survey taken by Harvard, more than 44% of teachers are thinking about leaving the profession. So I want you to think about where we would be in your individual schools or your school districts if 44% of our teachers did not show up tomorrow. And some of you may be thinking 44% of our teachers didn't show up today, because I know that there's lots and lots of districts who have kids out and teachers out with illness. But what would happen if 44% of our teachers left the profession tomorrow? Where would we be? it would be a struggle, wouldn't it? We wouldn't have teachers that were highly qualified at all grade levels. We would be doing double the work, somebody said. Maybe bigger class sizes, which means more students to teach to, more differentiation. It would mean more papers to grade, more tests, more assignments, more strategies we may need to be implementing. So think about all of those things. And then ultimately, we know that our kids would be suffering. Our kids would not be getting what they need on a daily basis if we had half the staff that we have today. So that's one of the reasons that in education, we're really trying to focus on self-care. What can we do to support ourselves? What can we do to support others? What do teachers need? I hope in your districts that your administration really is focusing on supporting you all and what your needs are. That's one of the things that we are definitely seeing an increase of across the state. So I want to know, I don't want to know, I want you to know. So I want you to be thinking about this. If you have a piece of paper, you can drop it into 4 quadrants. If you have some Post-it notes, just grab a Post-it note. But I want you to be thinking about what is weighing on you today. What is your stress? I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. I'm going to set a timer. And I want you to be thinking about what is your stress, what's weighing on you as it relates to work, personal life, global, which could be anything else affecting our world today. And then there's a category for other. So I'm going to set a quick timer for 2 minutes, and you guys can go ahead and get started with that. You do not have to share these with anyone else. This is just for you to work through today. You have 1 minute left. Ten seconds. Okay, if we can all come back together. Now, if anyone would like to, if you have 1 or 2 stressors that you would like to drop in the chat, go ahead and do so. If not, that is perfectly fine. Just going to kind of take a quick survey of what some of our general stressors are. So I see student behaviors is on here a couple times. Paperwork, student behaviors. Student behaviors is definitely a theme. Assessment and standardized testing. Students who are runners, totally understand that. Daughter graduating college, congratulations. My senior son may not make it till the end of the year, I'm not sure. Trying to balance it all, absolutely, paperwork. So it looks like most of you, a lot of you dropped a 1 in the chat, just saying that work was definitely the biggest stressor that you had. And then some of us were a little more specific on what the stressors were. But I think it's important that we think about what is causing us stress in order to think about the best self-care strategies or practices for us to implement. So I appreciate you all sharing those things. And I'm sure that several of you have things that you didn't want to share, and that's fine. I just want you to think about how can you best address those to support your needs as we move throughout some of the practices. So where is all of the stress coming from? Why are we so stressed today? Stress is at an all-time high in our society. We are exposed chronically to things that stress not only our mind, but our body as well. The overstimulation is something that our research tells us has been increasing over the past probably 15 years, and right now is at an all-time high. That includes things like social media, raising kids, media outlets from things going on around the world, social engagements, work, inflammatory foods and toxic chemicals. Some of the most recent research really is coming in about how those things also stress us without us realizing that they're stressing us maybe. Some inconsistent routines to fit it all in. I know several of you said not enough time to get things done. And then in our country specifically, we are sleeping less than we ever have before, as long as we have been tracking that sleep. So lack of appropriate sleep. So when we think about those causes of stress, we know that stress actually causes anxiety, and anxiety leads to something called depletion. So if you notice that the picture that's over on the right in the middle looks like 2 cell phones, which we know cell phones sometimes are the cause of some of the stress, but the cell phone on the left has that full battery. The cell phone on the right has that empty battery, almost dead. And so we have to think about the stressors that we have, how they're increasing and causing us anxiety. And then that anxiety leads to the depletion. And another word for that depletion really is burnout. And that's what we were talking about with that recent survey of 44% of educators saying that they are thinking about leaving the education field. So chronic stress has, we think, really become normalized. It's almost like people are heroes if they are working all the time and stressed all the time and trying to juggle so many things. And we know that that is not really the case. Those people are not heroes. It doesn't make them any different or any more superhuman than us if they're answering emails at 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever that looks like. The ability to cope oftentimes with that stress becomes overwhelmed, and that increases the anxiety. And then when we think about that depletion piece, we know that when the stress is going up, something has to fall. And so I think, how hard are we willing to fall? I think that's something for us to think about, because the harder we go and the longer we push without taking care of ourselves, then the harder it's going to be when we do deplete and when we hit that burnout wall. It creates a heaviness. Oftentimes it creates not being able to sleep or think or function or enjoy things within our everyday lives, including our families. So we want to make sure that we're supporting ourselves and supporting each other before we get to the depletion state. Another thing that we oftentimes hear about is something called the urgency culture. And so we have very much become in education part of this urgency culture, where we feel like we need to be connected to the world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. and respond immediately. So when we think about that immediate response, I don't know how many of you all have the setting on your phones, but when you get an email, does it pop up almost like an alert, a banner at the top of your phone, so that every single time you're getting an email, you immediately see it and you feel like when you see it and you read it, you need to respond. Or it could be a text message, or it could be someone asking a question, but that need, that urgency to respond to people immediately. It creates unrealistic expectations of ourselves and others. And when we are the ones that feel like we need to immediately respond and others don't immediately respond, then subconsciously we think, well, why are they not responding? Or they're not working as hard as I am, or things of that nature. And that's not necessarily the case. So that's something I want you to be thinking about when we think about some of the strategies you're going to put into place. Is that urgency culture? Are we feeding into that, or are we trying to set some boundaries and stop that? So for today's mantra, really, what is a mantra, I guess, is appropriate to talk about first, is a statement or slogan repeated frequently, and it's something that we want to instill in ourselves. It's a thought that we would like to instill in ourselves. So for the next 20 minutes, I really want you to think about, you have permission to rest. You're not responsible for fixing everything that's broken, especially in the next 20 to 30 minutes. You have permission to be happy and relaxed. You don't have to make anyone else happy except you. You have permission to take time and energy for yourself. And now is always the time to refill. So whatever you are refilling, your cup, your Starbucks cup, your coffee cup, your water bottle, now is always an okay time to refill. So how do we start this journey of self-care if this is something that we're uncomfortable with? Here's a couple different tips or hints. Be willing to try something new. And for today, I really just want you to think about 1 or 2 actions. So you don't have to put a plan in place today where we are going to put 17 things on a piece of paper and we're going to check back in with you in a month and say, how many of these can you check off? That is not what self-care is about. It's about committing to 1 or 2 actions, and then how can you build that plan in order to support, again, yourself. Protect time. So finding time is very hard, but finding time and then protecting time is even harder. Be willing to fail, because I promise when you start this journey and you try something, you're not going to be able to be consistent with it every single day at the same time or in the same way you thought you were going to be. It's okay to fail. You just have to be willing to get back up. And when we think about starting a journey, oftentimes we think about finishing the journey. So with self-care, there really is no finish line. This is something that we want to practice all the time. This is something we want to be able to be a model for. We want to teach others how to do, whether that's our kids or our grandkids or others within our buildings or whatever that looks like. So really thinking there is no finish line to this journey. So when we think about self-care, we really frame it in 8 dimensions of wellness. And so this is kind of our nationally accepted 8 dimensions of wellness and self-care framework. And so we'll be talking about these different domains today. I want you to spend just a second and look at these. Typically, I read them like I read a clock. And so I start with career, and then I make my way around to intellectual in that clockwise motion. So when we think about wellness, that's the state of being in good health, especially as an actively pursued goal. And again, remember, this is all about balance. We can't practice self-care 24 hours a day, or we wouldn't be able to perform our jobs, right? But what is the balance? What is the balance of when we do these things, how we do these things in order to support what we need to be the best us we can be? So I'm going to give you just a second to look over these 8 domains or dimensions and think about what that looks like for you. So the question is, what do each of these look like for you? Is there one of these domains that you're stronger in? Typically, we're strong in 2 to 3, and then typically we're really weak in 2 to 3. So just take a second, look at these 8 dimensions and reflect with yourself. So I want you guys to drop in the chat, which one of these do you think you're strongest in? Which of the dimensions of self-care do you feel like you're strongest in? I'm just going to go ahead and say I'm really jealous. Those of you that said physical is what you're strongest in. That's probably my weakest. See a lot of social, some spiritual, physical. Now I want you to think about what's your weakest one or two. What are your weakest areas, would you say? The areas that you don't focus on, you don't pay the most attention to. I see a couple people with me in the physical. So it really doesn't matter where we are. We just have to think about how can we balance some of these things. We are always going to be stronger in some areas and weaker in some areas, and that's perfectly fine. But are we doing something to address all of the areas? Are we intentionally looking at the different self-care categories and thinking about what could I do to support myself here? What can I do to support myself in this one? So think about that as we kind of talk through those different areas. And then I want you to think about how you're doing now. We really just did that. As you were saying, here's my strongest, here's my weakest. How are you doing now? So Jamie, if you don't care to drop that in the chat, that's actually the one that has a Wisconsin address. So you can see this is a self-care assessment. We don't have enough time to take this today while everybody's on, but this is something maybe you could do afterwards, or you could do tomorrow. It's really interesting to do this, I think, with your grade level or content level team you work with, or with your family. So do this. You can do it by yourself, but I think it's really great if you do this with a group of people and then can kind of talk about it. You also then can create accountability partners if that's something that you want to do or you're interested in. So there's the link to that. So how many of you are feeling overwhelmed yet? Anybody feeling like, okay, that's a lot. I'm not sure I can do all these different things. Does anybody feel overwhelmed? Maybe. And so we're going to jump in and talk about mindfulness really quickly. We also, in this slide deck, I will have a list of key terms that kind of helps us as we talk about, helps you guys as you go back and review and you think about where all these things fall and how they fit. But mindfulness really is a state. It's a mental state achieved by focusing attention and awareness on the present moment. So we know that mindfulness, when it's practiced, really helps support all of those 8 different self-care categories. And so mindfulness is one of the things that we're going to talk about today. When we think about mindfulness, I want you to think about stress management. I want you to think about being intentional. It's about awareness. It increases empathy, and it's paying attention for a purpose. So that really is what mindfulness is. You may have or be using pieces of this in your classroom. So that's what a mindful classroom may look like. But what does it look like when it applies to you as an adult? So how many of you all have heard of, or heard someone say, not heard of, I guess, but heard someone say, or have said yourselves, just breathe. It'll be okay, just breathe. I mentioned earlier that I do a lot with, let me make sure this is not going to play. I do a lot with behavior and educational psychology and counseling. And so if I had the number of times that I have been involved with a student who is escalated or an adult who is escalated, and somebody says, just breathe, I probably would be a millionaire. That is one of our favorite things that we like to say. It's okay, calm down, just breathe. Well, when we're in a heightened state or an escalated state, we can't think about learning any new content. But all the time we tell kids or we tell adults or we tell others, just breathe. And that's great and wonderful. But if we don't know how to breathe or the appropriate ways to breathe, then sometimes that does nothing but escalate the situation. So we're going to talk a little bit about, this is embedded into this slide deck. Again, you can go back and watch this. It kind of talks about some of the things I talked about earlier with the sphere and learning about breathing, but we're going to talk about some of these other pieces. Hang on one second. So learning how to breathe and teaching each other how to breathe. Slow, deep, paced breath. There are lots of different types of breathing we can do. And all the different types of breathing elicit different responses from our bodies. And so I think we want to think about what happens when we breathe slow, quick breaths. What happens when we breathe long, deep breaths? It does very different things to our heart rate. It does very different things to our brain. And we're going to talk about those for just a second. So deep, slow paced breathing is when we inhale through our nose. We count the number of breaths. We are waiting and watching and feeling for our chest and our stomach to rise as they expand with air. And then we exhale always for a longer count than we inhaled, because we want to ensure that we are putting out more carbon dioxide than we are inhaling oxygen. It's really important for our brain function. So what are some of the benefits when we breathe like this and we're engaging in mindful breathing? We know that stress causes unregulated breathing patterns. So when we are running from something or someone, when we are worried or scared, when someone does something in an environment we're in, such as yelling or screaming or arguing, we know that our breathing patterns change. We know that breaths get quicker and they get more shallow. And so we know what that does to our bodies and what that does to our brains. One of the things that the research has produced in about the last 5 years is that specific breathing strategies can be used as effective tools to manage thoughts, moods, and experiences, sometimes just as effective as medications can. So that is something that really is huge, that we didn't know before. And so I think it's something that is really important. We think about how can we utilize these tools to support us. And we know some of the research really from Harvard and Berkeley is where most of this is coming from, but talks about how our breathing and our mindful breathing can reduce anxiety. It can reduce symptoms of depression. It reduces distress, improves focus, and lowers blood pressure. So all of those definitely are positive things that we see. Slow, deep breathing stimulates something called the vagus nerve. And we're going to talk about that vagus nerve in just a minute. I'm sure that some of you have heard of that. Some of you may even have looked to see what that is or how it works or what it does. But I think this is where we get into the research of what the breathing does to our brain, our lungs, our bodies, and how it affects us in the end. And so we know that slow and consistent respiration, which is our rhythm synchronized breathing, it really activates our brain regions that control emotions and memory. We're going to look at those brain regions in just a second, because some of you may be going, well, what are those regions? We know that our slow, deep breathing also increases communication when sleeping between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. And so that's where our memories turn into, we take those memories from today or from just the past few minutes, and that's where they turn into something that goes in our filing cabinet, which we'll talk about as our hippocampus in just a few minutes. And so that's how we can remember things and what that looks like for learning new content and learning new information. We know also that it helps attention and regulate the nervous system. And it also activates something called the inusula, and that is our autonomic nervous system. And we'll talk about that in just a second too. So you may be learning some new vocabulary. You may be thinking, okay, I have no idea what Megan's talking about, but we're going to look at it in just a second. And I think it'll help make sense as we think about breathing and all the different things that the breath controls within our body. So this is a graphic. It looks like it might be a little bit fuzzy for you guys in the middle, but this is a graphic from MindUp. MindUp is one of our evidence-based programs that teaches students about the brain, the different areas of the brain, and how they work together. This is from the Goldie Hawn Foundation, and this specific graphic is from the middle school version of that program. And so with the Mind Up Brain, or the program, it teaches kids about the brain, but we're going to be focused and looking at these three main parts of the brain: the amygdala, which we call the gate, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. So as many of you know that have studied any part of trauma and how traumatic experiences affect our brains and the biology, how they change the biology of our brains, anytime new information comes into our bodies from things we see, things we hear, things we touch, things we smell, that information flows into our brain stem, into an area called the amygdala. And so that we talk about the amygdala as a gate. The amygdala is either open or it is closed. There is no in between. And so it really is the controller of the information that's coming from the outside world, what's getting into our brain, what's not getting into our brain. But that amygdala gate really is the controller of that information. So when we are in chronic state of stress, when we have traumatic events happen, that amygdala gate closes and information is not able to flow through our brain to different areas. When it is open, that's when the information is able to connect to the different levels of the brain. Some of you may have heard those referred to as the upstairs and downstairs brain. But neuroconnectors really help carry that information from the amygdala up to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is where emotions are regulated, and it's also where that memory goes into our filing cabinet, right there in the hippocampus. And then once the information is processed in the hippocampus portion of our brain, it goes to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is located kind of where our forehead is, and that's what controls memory, behavior, and planning. So that prefrontal cortex really has to be engaged to learn any new content or material. So those are our three main regions of our brain, and how the amygdala relates back to that thing called the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is one of the largest nerves in our body. It is the largest and longest cranial nerve, but that's a nerve that extends from our brain all the way through our body, and it touches every single system within our body. So that vagus nerve is something that absolutely affects things like digestion, heart rate, the way we're breathing. It really, really controls every single other system within our bodies, which is kind of crazy to think about. What happens in our brain really does control all those other things. It really tracks what's going on. It's responsible for lots of different pieces. Very interesting research around that vagus nerve. When we think about stress, and there are three types of stress, we think about that acute stress, chronic stress, and traumatic stress. Many of us are living in chronic stress. If you are really stressed within your work environment, if you feel like you don't have enough time to get things completed, if you feel like that you don't have enough time to go to the doctor, you don't have enough time to take a sick day, that's what we call that chronic toxic stress. And that's what a lot of us seem to be in all of the time. So when we are stressed, there's a hormone called cortisol that is produced. Cortisol is actually produced in the adrenal glands, which are on top of our kidneys. So when you think about stress, we don't always think about our kidneys and stress together, but those adrenal glands sit right on top of our kidneys, and that's what produces that hormone called cortisol. Does anybody know what cortisol does, especially as we age? What does cortisol cause? A lot of times school resource officers know the answer to this, and it cracks me up. Absolutely, it creates belly fat. And so we know that that cortisol creates belly fat, but that's a result of stress. So when you think about what it does control the use of fats within our bodies. It suppresses inflammation and increases really that inflammation to our joints, to our brain, to all different parts. It regulates our blood pressure, it regulates our blood sugar, and it controls how often and how deep we're able to get into that REM sleep cycle that we know we need. So when you think about stress, stress creates that cortisol, and then that cortisol does all of these awful things to our bodies, which is another reason that we know we need to focus on self-care. The other thing that I think is important for you all to know and be aware of is we have something called the hypothalamus that is actually in your brain, and that is located in the same area where the amygdala is. And so that amygdala and that hypothalamus together really are the controller of that cortisol production. So as we increase our stress, we increase our cortisol. So every time we have something stressful happen, a stressful situation, another stressful day, it's like somebody sitting there with a button, pushing that button. And every time that button is pushed on that controller, it creates more cortisol. And so then that cortisol goes into our bodies and it creates all these negative, bad effects. So all of those things are important as we think about what we are going to do for our own self-care. All right. So it goes back to our dimensions of wellness and dimensions of self-care. You can think of it maybe as 8 boxes. You can think of it as a circle into 8 different pie pieces, however you want to think about it. But I want you to be thinking about what are some of the things that fall under each category. So under career, we have possibly creating a professional development plan that is what you need, setting boundaries, creating a routine to leave it outside the door. So that means leaving school at school and leaving home at home. Do we need to take a class to learn a new strategy? Are we time blocking to make sure we have enough time to lesson plan so we feel like we are effective teachers? Are we observing master teachers? Or if we're a master teacher ourselves, observing new teachers? Some other things you could do within your school: start a secret buddy program, smile and encourage others on a daily basis, find a classroom tag out partner. If you don't know what that is, that's when you have a student. I know many of you mentioned earlier that you have some issues with behavior. Do we have a student we can trade out and share with a partner, or can we tag out and have someone come in for 5 minutes to teach our content while we take a breath and regulate in order to deal with that student's behavior? And then asking for help. So that's our career domain. When we think about physical, we really know what that looks like. But some of the things that we don't always think about in physical are things like regular doctor checkups, being able to sleep the appropriate amount. And then we know we have to eat healthy meals, but it's hard to eat healthy meals if we don't have that healthy food in our house. So are we blocking time for things like going to the grocery appropriate time? Or do we run in and say, okay, I've got 10 minutes, I can get just a few things. So those all fall under physical. Some of the things under social, think about finding your social support circle, finding a hobby, exploring new experiences. It's fine to say no to things sometimes. I know that there are always lots of social events going on, and it's okay if you don't go to every one of those. Spend energy on things that you enjoy and plan your time wisely. That moves us into the spiritual domain. So things included in that could be prayer, meditation, singing and dancing, spending time in nature, maybe practicing some grounding techniques, a study group, again, of like-minded people that may be focused around your church or your group that you work with prayer or whatever that looks like for you. Online video learning time, if that's something that is important to you. Swimming in the ocean, which goes back to nature, spending time in nature, playing with kids and loved ones, and some type of yoga practice. Then we go to emotional. Therapy is included in emotional, and there are a million kinds of therapy. That says kids, but there's really a million kinds. So when you think about therapy, most of us think about the typical go in, meet a therapist, sit down on a couch, talk to them about what we're stressed about or what's going on. But there really are lots of different types of therapy. There's art therapy and sound therapy that are gaining popularity among adults. There's also equine therapy that I know is gaining popularity with adults in this area, as well as some of those animal therapy pieces. I know that there is a new, they have rabbits they're doing therapy with. There's goat yoga, lots of different things in the Central Kentucky region around different types of therapy. So million different kinds. It doesn't have to be, I don't want to go in and sit down on a couch and talk to a therapist. Deciding and having affirmations, having self-compassion, being able to spend time with pets, practicing forgiveness, practicing generosity, and being able to say verbally, I love you to your loved ones. When we think about that environmental domain, that really is our surroundings. So what do our classrooms look like? What do our cars look like? What do our offices look like? Do we have time to garden? Do we have time to plant some new plants? Are we able to clean out closets and drawers? All of those things definitely affect our emotional well-being. And then intellectual self-care really goes to, are we allowing ourselves to learn something new? It could be as simple as watching a documentary, going to a museum. It sounds like lots of you did some of this on Saturday when you went to Frankfurt. So just able to learn something new. Tips for continued self-care, really, it just goes back to committing to one or two things, finding people who support you, being able to avoid negative areas, negative situations, and being solution focused. So we know that we are not always going to succeed, but are we willing to go back to our plan and try again? So those are some of our things we want to think about for those tips for self-care. So we have, Jamie, if you will drop that other link in the chat, we have just a template, a really simple template for you guys to download. When you open this link, it will take you to a website. You have to scroll down about halfway on the page and it will say download template. And you just click that and then it will download a Word document for you. So I'm going to give you just about 2 or 3 minutes to think about. I'm not going to have you fill this out right now, but I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes just to think about and drop in the chat what are 1 or 2 different or new self-care practices that we may have talked about today that you think you could add or you think you would benefit from. So I'm going to stop the share. Actually, I'm not going to stop the share. I'm going to go back to our 8 domains. Let me show this. So I'm going to set that timer for 2 minutes. And if everybody will focus and think intentionally about 1 or 2 different self-care strategies that you might be able to add to your routine or to start a routine, we would love to know what those are. If you know what those are right now, go ahead and drop those in the chat. And if you don't know, we're going to give you 2 minutes. And I just looked at the time, and Jamie, I may not have 2 minutes, but I did set the timer for 2 minutes.
That's fine. It'll be okay if we go a little over. Okay, you have 1 minute. Okay, that is our 2 minute timer. So if we can all come back together, I'm seeing lots of great things in the chat.
I know lots of us are going to focus on sleeping. Sleep is so important, and it's hard sometimes to get what we need. Okay, I'm going to be sharing the slide deck with Jamie and Wendy, and they can send that out to you guys or share however they share those. It was great to be with you all today and to think and talk about some of these things. I hope that you're taking at least one thing away from today that you will be able to implement and think about how it affects your brain and your body and your health. So Jamie, I'm going to turn it